Because you've always taken such charge.
You are listening
to the Border Chronicle.
I am excited about today's interview, and it features the excellent researcher Nathan Akehurst and the much beloved anthropologist and lawyer Petra Molnar, who's also the associate director of the Refugee Law Lab and who has a forthcoming book that is tentatively titled Artificial Borders, AI, Surveillance, and Border Tech Experiments that Border Chronicle readers will definitely want to check out, and we will definitely let you know when this book is released. For today, the point of our conversation was to look at border violence and security in a warming world. And that is the title of a paper in which Nathan was the principal author. And we're publishing that paper right alongside this podcast. The hope in looking at this particular issue and framing of climate change and displacement and borders is to frame our thinking as we get closer to the big United Nations summit in Egypt in November. And for those who haven't done it yet, check out our discussion thread that we had last week in which we discussed this very issue. In the podcast, we do spend a good bit of time looking at border technology and displacement and identifying those two dynamics as trends that are increasing with time and a way to look at the future. But Petra and Nathan ask and talk about the possibilities of a way out of this. Actually, maybe I'll start with you, Nathan, and just ask you, what on earth does climate change have to do with borders, right? Is there anything?
So I guess the most useful way to come in on that is to talk briefly about borders and then about climate-linked migration, and then connects the two. And I think there's been this huge expansion in what a border means in the last few decades that, most people will think of them in their daily lives as as lines that divide up countries, basically. But, what you've seen is an increase in the infrastructure on those lines, a lot of the technology, and I think this is something that Petra will get into more, but also the stuff, the legal regime at borders and the exceptionalism that allows you to get away with the sheer number of human rights abuses on borders in, say, the Mediterranean or the southern US. But it's not just what happens on those borderlines, it's also the extension of the practice and the technology and the logic of the borders kind of deep inside the countries they're policing. So take, ICE raids or the ripping up of domestic law to protect citizens in a way that ultimately rebounds on us all. And then you've got this externalization issue of pushing the border outside of the country, and you have these various kind of dodgy deals of other countries, these increasingly distant border posts, and say the European border ends up being experienced halfway down Africa, or the US border halfway through Central America, and so on. And this is all happening in the context of climate change being an increasing factor in human movement. And that's both kind of direct displacement, aftermath of natural disasters, that type of thing, and also more broadly, the way in which a heating world and its effect on ecosystems, on economies, is a factor in why people feel they have to move. And then you connect these two things up, because actually, a lot of climate-linked displacement movement isn't across borders, much less between the global south and north. It's within countries. It's people moving within the US and the aftermath of a hurricane, say. But there is a certain amount of cross-border migration, and it's getting attention because a certain section of politics of the political establishment are obsessed with border control and with protecting and walling off the global north. And here you get into where it properly connects up, where you've got lockup of incentives, where you've got people who profit from border control and border control technology, the people who sell detention centers, new tech, weapons, so on and so forth, that need new markets, and they sell the idea of expanding border control as a solution to the climate emergency in order to protect to wall off our richer and more powerful countries from people moving. And they're kind of pushing an open door in a lot of places for two reasons. One, because as I've already mentioned, you've got a section of politics that sees political gain in attacking people who move, principally on the right, but by no means just on the right. And secondly, because states have all these coercive systems, they have huge military, police, border forces, and it's a lot easier to look at a crisis like climate and think, rather than, retooling our economy, retooling the way we do things, the way we think about security and public safety, in order to deal with the actual problem, why not just use the resources we've got? Unfortunately, you can't do that because climate change isn't something you shoot at, no matter how hard you try. But there is, as I've gone through, a lot of vested interests in convincing people that is how you deal with it.
Yeah, it makes me think, like, thinking about the profit motive, and that there's companies involved in this, and there's money to be made. There's those market forecasts that are out there that look at like the border and or homeland security industries, and it's interesting to me that as we look at forecasts, and especially in the last 3 to 4 years, how climate is more often like entering the reason why these markets are increasing. And I've been looking particularly at like different border technology, these homeland security technology forecasts, and it seems to me that as looking at those forecasts, and they often go into 2025, or the global market's going to grow to, I think one of them I saw was close to $1 trillion by 2030. I've seen like way up in the billions, like $750 billion on this market. It seems to me that we're heading to a world where there's more and more technological enforcement that's happening, and that's why I'd love to hear from you, Petra, about what you think about these sort of dynamics as we broil up in this climate crisis more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Todd. I mean, I think it's such an important element to all of this because, I think a lot of the things that Nathan already mentioned, they really remind us that we are really dealing with a regime that's been historically violent and discriminatory and exclusionary, but it has been made all the more sharper, not only just by the degradation of the environment, but also through the use of these new and increasingly draconian technological interventions. And so for me, as a lawyer and an anthropologist, I've spent quite a lot of time now for the last over 6 years, I guess, trying to really get a sense of this global panopticon of this new border tech that's been springing up in some really difficult ways across the world. And, for me, having a global perspective is helpful because sometimes the contextual specificity that we all look at is really important. But being able to kind of zoom out and see what is happening globally really shows this kind of broader ecosystem that gives rise to really high-risk tech with very little regulation, very little oversight, and virtually no accountability. And so, I look at technologies, again, from this kind of broader perspective, whether you want to think of it in terms of migration management or border control or border enforcement, but these are the kind of ideas that oftentimes give the impetus behind a lot of these projects. But it's really been the proliferation of all sorts of things, such as more, I could say, traditional surveillance type tech like drones, or all sorts of aerial surveillance mechanisms, to automated decision making its way into visa applications, to some really, really outlandish, super experimental stuff like so-called AI lie detectors at the border, and sound cannons being rolled out, and things like this. I mean, it's easy to almost think of it as something so dystopic and almost something like science fiction. But, for me, I will never forget this one moment. And it was actually right around the time I think that you and I met in Arizona. I was in the middle of the Sonora, and that is when the Department of Homeland Security announced that they were planning to roll out those really horrible robodogs, military-grade quadruped technology that, has already been critiqued for all sorts of reasons in the kind of autonomous weapons space or criminal justice space. But to think that this is something that's going to be rolled out in already violent border zones was really horrifying. And there's nothing as kind of strange and amazing about doing the work that I do, because, I was literally on the soil of the Sonora, kind of seeing also the beauty in a lot of these borderlands, and then also being faced with this cold, draconian, horrible technology. For me, I often think about this strange dichotomy that a lot of us are engaged in when we do this border work. I mean, borders are inherently violent, they're inherently discriminatory, they are full of power differentials, but oftentimes they're also in such really beautiful spaces. I mean, the Sonora Desert environmentally is something so stunning, and same with the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea, or parts of East Africa where a lot of technology is also being tested, where I just visited. I mean, they're stunning places, and you really see this strange confluence between these really affecting environments, then being faced with this cold, dehumanized technology. There is something to be unpacked there as well, this kind of dichotomy. I really think about that a lot.
Yeah, I do too. I think about that constantly. I mean, I go out into the desert here where I live just south of Tucson in the Sonoran Desert, and I'm just blown away every single time by just the beauty of it. And then you start cruising around like you did, Petra, and maybe now we'll see robo dogs, right? Or you see those integrated fixed towers that are now in certain places on every single hilltop. I liked your terminology, the global panopticon, right? I was just east of Douglas, Arizona, right along the borderlands, and I noticed that every time I came down out of the hills, like as soon as you got out of the view of one of those towers, you were in the view of another, and it was just the more I did, the more we traveled, the more it just seemed how aggressive this is, right? Those technologies.
Yeah, totally. But what I found really interesting as someone who's kind of spent time in multiple areas is, I think in the Sonora corridor, it is much more visible. Like you say, you see the towers, you can kind of feel this omnipresence there. You can also go to the wall and touch it, and and then you lift your hand off and there's rust, almost like blood on your hand, like you see it. Whereas in the Mediterranean and Aegean and a lot of the, let's say, the Greek-Turkey border where I've done work, it's much more insidious. It's more difficult to see it. You don't see it in that kind of embodied way. It's almost more disturbing when it's so hidden, right? But then of course, then you have those horrible prison-like refugee camps that are replete with all sorts of tech too. So for sure, it's also in your face there.
Yeah, that's one of the also interesting things about it. Even in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, you have the invisibility of a lot of those technologies. So it's simultaneously invisible and very visible. It's visible when it wants to be, and invisible at other times. And I remember going to the Border Security Expo and seeing the robodogs being displayed, and I think the slogan behind the vendor, Ghost Robotics, I think is the name of the company, and behind it was this slogan that said "Robots that feel the world," right? And I was like, wow, that's that's like a drone, right? Ground drone, and then at the same time, feel this world we're in. Like, what world are we in? What is this world we're in? Like, the world we're in is one in a climate crisis, right? Too, and actually along those lines too, Nathan. Like one thing that I think is a huge important point, and is this idea of a border industrial complex. I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more what that actually is, and how that works in a global sense, and how does that intersect with climate?
Sure. So take this week, right? You've got there's a fantastic story in the Guardian Australia a couple of days ago about Alexander Downer, who's the former Australian foreign minister, who was absolutely central to the kind of promotion and build up of the offshoring regime there. And I think terms like offshoring end up being kind of, cover up the reality of this stuff. We're talking about the exile of hundreds of asylum seekers to, off the coast and out of sight of observers and monitors, into conditions of, children getting locked up, people, survivors these days with like lifelong lung problems because of the chemicals in the old mines they were kept in, suicide, so on and so forth, all around absolute disaster. But of course, again, it made a lot of people a lot of money, despite the horror and squalidity of these conditions. It was around I think $500,000 per asylum seeker. And this guy has just been appointed to the UK's independent, or apparently independent oversight panel, which I'm sure will provide entirely independent advice of the Rwanda offshoring policy, which has been made the kind of flagship immigration policy of the right-wing government in Britain. And also sitting on that panel is a consultant who works for the Danish state doing a similar kind of offshoring scheme there. So there's a part of it which is politics and state and sharing all this expertise and building it up. But there's a part of it that's private as well. So, you know, the G4S, Serco, the big kind of state contracting firms that kind of wouldn't exist without states in a way are responsible for running the detention centres in both Britain and Australia. A lot of the tech that Petra mentions will be produced by the same firms and then marketed in similar ways in hugely different operational contexts. And then, you know, there's another interesting report from Corporate Europe Observatory that came out about a year ago or so, which like reveals that both the number of players and the level of aggressiveness with which they lobby, say, the European Union and are kind of behind how state border expansion policies, such as the kind of the 4 or 5 billion euros, I think it is, that Frontex is getting over the next 5 years. You bring climate change into this, and I'm going to lean on another piece of recent reporting here, which came from Friends of the Earth in February, and you see how linked up all these industries are, and you see some of your big kind of investment firms, your BlackRocks and your State Streets, and the money that they've got in border violence, in all of the firms that I've just mentioned, in oil and gas, in all the kind of firms that are much more directly responsible for climate breakdown, and in big agribusiness and the land clearances and the violence necessary to carry out the extraction and dispossession that agribusiness depends on, and then also that being another kind of major contributing factor in climate change. So you can see the kind of vicious circle of climate of extraction, of climate pollution, and the movement that drives, and then the way in which like violent and responses to that movement are sold. And at every point of the process, the same batch of firms, who often also have a kind of revolving door between the people that sit on their boards and in positions of power, are bringing home the money from it.
Right. Actually, I'd like to ask you this, Petra. Would, like, when you look in terms of what Nathan's describing and almost this industrial complex, it just seems like it has this life of its own, right? Like it's just propelling into the future the same or more of what we're already seeing, right? And so like what do you see? How does that mean, like, really physically and tangibly for people?
I think that's such a good question, because I think it gets at one of the scariest elements of all of this. And I think for me, it's really realizing how seemingly intractable a lot of this is, because there's so much money to be made in big tech and then big border tech that we're talking about. And, you know, you mentioned going to one of those expos. I've also been to some here in Europe. And I have to say, you know, I've seen some really, really difficult stuff over the, last decade or so of doing this kind of work. But I have to say some of the most disturbing stuff came from those kind of expos and conferences where the private sector is selling their wares to the government, these kind of tech toys, so to speak. Except these things are robo-dogs, they're drones, they're tanks, they're military-grade technology. And it's clear that the bottom line, obviously, of the private sector is to make money off of this. It's not to be human rights compliant or to assist people with asylum applications or anything like that. It's to make money. And for me, from a legal perspective, what I find really disturbing is we're really talking about some fairly problematic public-private partnerships where you have states making partnerships with private sector for the development and deployment of this tech that they themselves can't do in-house. And then it really skews not only kind of what is normalized, like somehow we've just accepted that robo-dogs are the next thing, right? Like, why wasn't there a public discussion about any of this? It just happens. And then all of us, human rights monitors, lawyers, journalists are playing catch up, trying to say, hold up, like what actually is happening? But for me, it's actually more insidious than that. It's also about priority setting, right? If you have the private sector so baked in and their whole bottom line is to make money and to push particular priorities to the forefront, it's perhaps not surprising, that we're developing AI lie detectors to be tested on people at the border or refugees and not using AI to root out racism at the border. I mean, it's a bit of a simple example, but to me it's so instructive because there's a clear priority that has been set in this system. And because the private sector is out to make a big buck, I really don't see this changing anytime soon. If anything, actually, I see it getting worse. As the world turns sharper in terms of border enforcement, as more people will be forced to move due to climate displacement, and as more kind of inroads the private sector is able to make, it's going to be really, really difficult to undo.
The lie detector technology is caught my attention. Like, what is it? How is that working? Is that being deployed in places yet?
So the project I was referring to was called iBorder Control, and it was one of the Horizon 2020 projects, which basically means it got funding from the European Union for the development of a so-called AI lie detector that purported to discern whether someone was more likely than not to be telling the truth when interacting with an avatar at a border. And this is just one of those projects. There's also another project called Avatar that was going to be rolled out in different jurisdictions. But just as an example, this is one of the ideas that was kind of being pushed forward. And just as an aside, as someone who's a part-time academic, I find this piece interesting. There was a university that was involved in the development of this project, almost as a kind of academic washing or objectivity washing this kind of project. And I think that is a huge, huge piece to this conversation too. Different actors that are involved in the political economy of this development, including academics. We all have to be very, very careful about this kind of stuff. But for me, if I put my refugee lawyer hat on, I mean, lie detection generally is very, very dubious. In certain jurisdictions, even a traditional lie detector, the one that kind of goes back and forth that you see on CSI or whatever, that's not even admissible in a court of law, for example. So now we're developing AI type lie detection, and to then be tested out on people who are migrating or crossing borders or potentially claiming asylum. I mean, how can an AI lie detector deal with differences in cross-cultural communication? I mean, I've represented people when I used to litigate that didn't feel comfortable making eye contact with a decision maker of the opposite gender due to culture or religion or a variety of reasons. And then perhaps more subtly, what about the impact of trauma on memory? And the fact that, we never tell stories in a linear way anyway, let alone remembering something mundane like what I had for breakfast yesterday. Imagine, when you're trying to recount the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to you. I'm just trying to stretch it, but I think it's important to think about this stuff. Human beings, human decision makers, have a problem with plausibility, credibility, and truthfulness. We make very, very problematic assumptions about how a person is supposed to act, quote unquote, at the border, in a refugee claim. And a lot of these are very global north, very Western norms of plausibility that don't map onto the diversity of lived experience. And that's when humans make these decisions. So imagine what happens if we start augmenting or replacing human decision makers who are already flawed with the complexities of human migration with a machine decision making project. Hugely, hugely worrisome.
Ooh, it's like a glimpse into the future that's chilling, right? It's I remember the University of Arizona was or is, I'm not sure if that's still happening, but they were developing a lie detector technology, and people would have to put their fingers in. I think I took their pulse, like going across the border. And when I go across the border, which I do quite often, and I have the documents to do so, I still feel nervousness and I'm not even being like anything that you're saying. Like and then, right, Nathan, with the kind of combination, looking at a world of more of that stuff and more border enforcement and of course more walls and it's almost like you have to just look at all this as the same, right? Quote unquote smart walls and
Yeah, so there's a couple more points I wanted to come in with on this. The first is about like international action, and and there was something very interesting that happened a couple of years ago, and you're seeing more and more of it recently. But the example I want to pick on was in Ceuta, in this Spanish enclave in Morocco, in 2021, where there was this, significant movement of people in a very short space of time across a narrow channel into Spanish territory, and there'd been this kind of dispute between Morocco and Spain beforehand over something to do with Western Sahara. But anyway, the point is that Morocco was promptly accused of weaponizing migration. Of trying to force Spain's hand into doing its diplomatic bidding by allowing people in. And there are a few things coming out of that. The first, that like it's a way of justifying behavior that would otherwise be regarded as absolutely inhuman, because suddenly you're not talking about the humans, you're not talking about the small boy floating across the channel on couple of like plastic bottles that was in all the footage. You're talking about a hostile state, and then that like justifies the kind of militarized response to it. And the other thing is that even if that's true, even if like states are increasingly using this stuff in the context of interstate rivalry, well, that's the world we've created, right? Because we have these whole system of deals with third countries that allow the global north to kind of outsource its violence beyond its own borders, to not be held accountable under its own human rights processes, and to air its dirty laundry somewhere else. And so then, what does that do to diplomacy? What does that do to the kind of world you're creating, the kind of factors and that are governing interstate relations? And I think one of the most pernicious parts of this is that so often then these deals are sold as kind of as partnerships to do with like development and resilience and action on our shared challenges and all the kind of softer language you would use about these things. And then I think the final point I'd want to make about that is that all of this is sold and again is publicly justified as protecting us in some way. And this is an age-old story, right? There's always been this kind of attempt to get people to trade freedom for security, and that ends in them getting neither. That's not new, but the scale of the technology and the power involved is new. And the existence of the climate crisis and the very real possibility of significant parts of the ecosystem breaking down is new. And I think that's a message for the climate movement, that there's a lot of climate activists that will think migration is this like third rail in Western politics. It's a nightmare. As soon as you touch it, you open a can of worms. And actually, you have to talk about this stuff. You may think that it's difficult, but you need to deal with it, because the whole process that we've been talking about is a process by which the impetus towards climate action gets misdirected into border violence, into decreasing stability. And the people who care about the future of the environment and the future of human life in that environment need to think. We've spent years saying it's time to act, it's time to act, it's time to act. And the central question now is, well, what is this action actually going to look like? What are the, who are the actors involved going to be, and what incentives are going to underpin how they act?
Yeah, that's like looking at, for example, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and going into their documents around climate change. You can go back to what, like 2013, and see their climate action plan, and they're talking about understanding that displacement's going to happen in increasing fashion in Central America, and like in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador. They specifically mention those countries, or also the Pentagon reports on climate change that have been going on for decades now. What do they have? I think they look 25 years into the future to plan for future battlefields. So they're always looking in the future, right? So you have so the idea in the U.S. it's kind of comical at sometimes, because you have a military establishment that's quote unquote conservative, and then you don't think they're looking at climate change at all. but they totally are, and they're looking at it completely in how they determine what future battlefields are. And I would say with battlefields, I'd now put borders, because the border is a battlefield, and an invisible battlefield at times that's not really captured, but it's a battlefield. I mean, just looking at these realities, increasing displacement projected. Nobody knows how much it will be. And another thing to mention is the ability for people even to go back to where they, like if there's sea level rise or desertification, can people even return to where they were, the places they're leaving? And internal displacement monitoring centers shows every year, that I think the average is about 25 million per year that they've been able to tabulate as people being displaced due to climate or due to environmental reasons, which they associate having to do with climate. And then you have the other trend, which is the borders, the global border apparatus. And so I want to pose this to you both. We have this big climate summit coming up in Egypt, right? In the next month, in November. If you could go to the table there, if you could take something that you think might even be implemented, let's just imagine that could be the case. I know. First of all, do you think that these issues are being understated at these climate summits? I think, Nathan, you alluded to that when you were just talking. And then what would you bring and how would you emphasize that this is something that needs to be taken on a global level? And then what should we do about it?
I mean, I think ultimately it's just reversing where we are at the moment, right? There was this fantastic piece of statistics that came out around the last COP, and that tracks the difference between the amount that was being spent on increasing border security in these various absurd ways and the amount that was being spent on climate finance for the global south. And in some countries it was up to 16 times as higher. And, I'm slightly simplifying and generalizing here, but if you could just simply swap that route, if you could say, well, we take all this resource funding, thinking, all this political, financial, moral energy that is going into creating a more divided, more dangerous world, and start putting it into actually protecting people, into helping people, into ensuring that people, quite often have the right to stay as well as the right to move, that environments and habitats are protected, but also that when they do move, they can do so in safety, and in dignity, and in a better world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think sometimes in these conversations, particularly, when we talk about these high level summits like COP and like various different fora that we're all part of, at the national or supranational level as well, I think it's easy to forget that we're talking about real people. We're talking about real people who have rights that we've all agreed that that's something that, are afforded to every person on the planet: freedom of movement, the ability to apply for asylum and seek protection. And I'm a reluctant lawyer, right? Like, I don't think that the legal regime as it stands is sufficient by any means, but it is there. And I think we've been talking about it in so many kind of obfuscatory ways. And often, again, I think we forget that there are real people at the center of this. And I think one of the reasons why that is there's a lot of talking about communities without involving them really from the get-go in these conversations. And so I think that is something concrete that could be done better, whether at COP or whether at other similar events, is really interrogating what does meaningful participation from affected communities look like? I mean, are people invited to the table? Are they not even invited, but are they allowed to actually set the table themselves? Are they the ones who get to determine what kind of world we are striving for, right? And I think really our space is also, we need to do a lot more work in terms of making sure that the lived experiences of those who are at the sharpest edges of these violent borders are really front and center in the conversations.
Totally concur. And I went to the Paris one in 2015, and that was so... There's a whole indigenous contingent that was just almost completely and totally left out of the main conversations and couldn't even get in the doors to get in there in the first place. And lots of people are talking about that. So that's a huge issue. Is there anything else that you would like to say about any of this before we sign off?
Just to say thanks for having us. I think, we think in creative ways, and I think it's really wonderful to have these types of podcasts and conversations cross-cut disciplinary lines as well. And I think it's really great what you guys are doing. So thanks a lot for having us on.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one last thing. Petra mentioned the power of the law briefly, as much as a skeptic of it as she may be sometimes. And last week, a very interesting case began. It's a guy who was left for dead at the Aegean border in by a Greek Coast Guard boat under the supervision of Frontex. Only a boy at the time, not even turned 18, and after being forced back to Turkey, having been through the worst experience of his life, he's come around again to not just survive it, but to be up in court at the moment, taking Europe's border army to task for their actions and to try and achieve some kind of justice and accountability for it. And if he's able to do something like that, to go from point A to point B in that way, then we all can and should have hope and keep the faith, and imagine that, as bad as things might seem at the moment, things can change, things do change, and we can and will win.
Yeah, one last thing. Could you just let listeners know where's the best places to find you? If they want to find out more about your work and what you're up to and find more of this analysis that you're imparting today.
Sure. I co-run a project called the Migration Technology Monitor, which really aims to push resources into mobile communities and really give people who are on the move themselves the ability to think about border surveillance and border tech. So if you go to migrationtechmonitor.com, I think, that's us. We're also available in French, Spanish, and Arabic, as well as English. And we are starting a fellowship program for people on the move who will be doing a lot of projects on border tech in the next year. So stay tuned for that. And if you want more of the academic side, check out the Refugee Law Lab at York University in Toronto. That's my academic hat.
Thank you.
And for my part, I mean, I'm not really on Twitter much. I wouldn't advise following me there, but I write for Jacobin magazine, often on border stuff. So that's probably where you can find most of my recent work. And also, I would just like to again thank Todd for having us on, and to plug the Border Chronicle, where obviously the paper that I drafted on some of this stuff will be available.
The Border Chronicle is reported by Todd Miller and Melissa Del Bosque, based in Tucson, Arizona. This interview was edited by me, Lily Clark. If you like what you're hearing, please consider rating us on your favorite podcast platform. It'll help other people find the show. You can read and listen to more local border reporting on our website, theborderchronicle.com.